So, welcome, Malcolm, to your own podcast, Slay Your Dragons. We've chosen to begin the podcast with having you in conversation as the first guest on the podcast, and then you will be welcoming lots of guests over the next weeks and months. So, we thought it was a good idea to get to know you a little bit, the why behind the podcast, and give everyone a bit of a sneak preview of what to expect from the podcast, too.
Right.
So we're looking forward to that conversation over the next 30, 40 minutes or so. We've chosen the name for the podcast, Slay Your Dragons, as it's the same name as your book. And I wonder whether we could start by you saying a little bit about why you wrote the book, like the story behind the book.
Thank you, John. Well, it's my third book, and both the other books took around 4 years to write. Slay Your Dragons with Compassion took 7 months to write. And it feels like it wrote itself. So the inspiration for it, and I want to just stress in advance, this is not a grief memoir, but the inspiration for it was the death by suicide of my daughter Melissa in 2014. And I had to find some resources to deal with that. You don't just lose a child and go, oh, well, I'll grieve for a week and then move on. And so I started recognizing that I already had some resources well in place. So I joined a number of different support groups, a Samaritans support group for those who've been bereaved by suicide, other ongoing groups. And I realized that one of the things I needed to stress was how much we need support at these times, but also we need to have a support system already in place. You can't just suddenly magic a fantastic support system out of nowhere. And I think in the times we're living in, the recognition is that probably the most important chapter in the book is the chapter on Sangha. And Sangha is a Buddhist term for the communion with others of like mind. It was originally about monks, but now it's considered to be, a Sangha is considered to be a spiritual connection and community. I've been thoroughly educated, and not in a way that I would have chosen, but a way that's chosen me by the death of my daughter. And that was the inspiration for the book. The understanding of what happens in those moments of extreme adversity and how we manage them. So over the next few years after she died, so she died in 2014, but over the next few years after she died, I felt like I wanted to find a way of catharting through, not by going into groups and bashing my head on the floor like they used to do in the old days of encounter groups, but finding a way of actually getting this out of my system into something creative. And I came across a chap in 2018 who's now a good friend called Ben Crabe. And Ben and I talked about doing, originally about doing a group for empaths, which was the original inspiration to sort of recognize that Melissa was extremely empathic. And when we're extremely empathic, we tend to suffer more because we can feel all the pain of the world. And we have to really learn how to resource ourselves in order not to be overwhelmed by that. So the group idea just didn't quite float. But I said one day, how about if we did a book? And he said, yeah, let's have a go at that. Ben is an editor and also a publisher. So he had lots of capacity for doing a book. And we started to put together the framework for a book. Originally, it was going to be called The Empath's Journey. But actually, that didn't feel right. Then I realized there was a term that I have been using in my groups for many, many years, which is slay your dragons with compassion. And that term, what it means is, don't go into things half-cocked. If you're going to deal with something, go all the way in and tease it out and deal with it so that you can move on from it. It's about speaking our truth. It's about learning to give difficult feedback when that's there to be done. And so this book started to be born, first of all, with Melissa's story, which was obviously a very moving story. But then finding, and I normally hate these ideas of 10 ways to do this, but it did feel like there were 10 practices. So that's really what we've set up. And the book has actually sort of had its own life. And I was very touched when the first endorsement came from Elizabeth Gilbert, who wrote Eat, Pray, Love. And she and I had a very deep conversation about the loss of her partner when she came and spoke at Alternatives, which was the series that I used to run at St James's Piccadilly. And Elizabeth gave me a beautiful quote. It really heartened me to see that she'd been touched by the book. And then we put on Eckhart Tolle at the Albert Hall in 2019. And I said to him, would you be open to reading my manuscript? And he said, yeah, sure. And I gave him the manuscript and didn't think much more of it. And about 6 months later, just before we were going to press with the book, Eckhart wrote a very beautiful endorsement as well for the book. So, and then I was traveling a bit with Jack Cornfield, who we took to Spain to do a retreat. And again, the same thing with Jack. Wrote a really lovely review of the book as well. And so I started to gather some very good affirmation, which gave me a lot of inspiration. Not that, hey, I got all the celebrities sort of like, sort of writing about the book, but actually that the people had been touched by it. And I think that's really what I want to do in this work. And what I really want to do in the podcast series is to touch people's hearts, to have people connect. This is what I do in groups, to have people connect with a story, with their own story, and suddenly feel like they've been fully penetrated by the energy that comes through. So I'm going to have some very interesting guests in the next little while who are going to talk about basically their seminal moments, the times when they've had to meet their dragon, slay their dragon, and move on. I love dragons, by the way. This is not about becoming a sort of a nasty piece of work who's out there stabbing dragons to death.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that about dragons too. Thank you. I mean, they're amazing affirmations for the book, aren't they, in terms of people who are kind of really doing so much work in this field. Could you also say, Malcolm, a little bit about your own professional experience, just to give people a sense of your capacity, like for holding these conversations and the holding you do in your other work? Because I mean, I really appreciate you beginning with your own personal experience and the tragedy of losing your daughter Melissa. But yeah, could you say a bit about your professional experience?
Yes, I'm now in my 70s. When I went to public school, and my father was very keen that I would have a profession, so I started studying accountancy, which fitted me like a like a tank, not like a glove. And although I'm quite good with figures, it wasn't what I wanted to do with my life. I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. But one day a friend of mine said, hey, there's a vacancy in the estate agency firm where I work. And I thought, this is a giant leap for me. I went from a profession to a semi-profession and started working as an estate agent. And then one night I was with some mates around at my friend's house, and he had these tiny little pieces of blotting paper. And he said, this is LSD. Why don't we just try this together? So he put Pink Floyd on, and we're sort of lying down and sort of like, getting quite high. And suddenly I had this experience that who I thought I was not anything like the wholeness of who I am. And it was such a visceral experience. I started trying to talk to my friends about it, and they said, hey man, you're stoned, you'll come down in a while. And in their minds, I never came down from that experience. But what happened is I got opened. And in that opening, I recognized that I was actually part of the universe, part of the divine, part of the cosmos. And I determined that I would find a meaningful way to spend my life, to give my life to. So I tried all sorts of things. I worked for a while in a terminal cancer hospice as an auxiliary nurse. I worked in an old people's day centre. I worked in a Whole Foods store because my diet changed from Cokes and hamburgers to Whole Foods. And then one day I volunteered for Friends of the Earth to run a whale day for them. And when I was working as a volunteer in the office, and one day the phone rang, and it was Mike Oldfield talking about nuclear power in Stroud. And I said, hey, we're doing a gig for Friends of the Earth on Whale Day. Would you be open to playing? And he said, sure. So suddenly I had Mike Oldfield, who hadn't played for years at that stage, coming and playing at this whale day. From there, Greenpeace sort of like invited me to go and work for them. So I worked and sailed on the Rainbow Warrior for a while. So I was trying out all these bits and pieces. And at the same time, in my early 30s, I went into therapy because I was having difficulties in all my relationships with women. And I finally started to recognize that the sort of the obvious factor with all of these was me. There must be something I'm doing that's attracting all of this difficulty to me. So I'd been in therapy with a guy called Ian Gordon Brown, who was the founder of transpersonal psychology, for some 3 years. And I decided to go and do a therapy group. And I walked into this group and I suddenly knew, it was like everything that sort of came through me, that I wanted to run groups, that was what my purpose in this life was. And I just thought, this is crazy. You're jumping ahead of, you're getting something from it. But I recognized that the person who was running the group was not running it authentically. And I also recognized that I had the capacity to do that. And something now that I've developed for more than 40 years. I run an ongoing 1-year group, which is one weekend a month for a year, which I've been doing since 1990. And it's a transformational space. And so I also do one-to-one work, I do some coaching work, but my main thing is running and holding groups. And I also had a TV series on Channel 4 in the early 2000s called Made for Each Other, where me and a divorce lawyer filmed all these couples, and for 24 hours a day for 2 weeks, and then brought them into the studio and took a look at their relationship. And I can tell you, anyone's relationship dissected over 2 weeks is going to look weird. And we had some really interesting stuff, but it also gave me a feeling about broadcasting. So I had a really strong feel for that. I did some work for in-flight entertainment, doing DJing for airlines and stuff like that. So I had lots of different explorations, but my whole thing was about groups and about actually, I'm much better with the spoken word than I am with the written word, although Slay Your Dragons has come out really well. And I've tried since then to do 2 more books, and they're not as good, and I can't do them. But I thought that what I want to do is actually to sort of like to draw the wisdom out of people and see what it is that they've learned in their lives.
Thank you for that description, Malcolm. It's been a rich journey so far.
Well, I've loved working with online events. It's like, it just feels like a rhythm that fits me very well.
Yeah. Well, yes, you've been doing groups with us at online events too, where people can come in and have really a feel for that experience and have a transformative moment in a couple of hours. And yeah, which is a lovely invitation also into your year-long work.
Yes.
I'm trying to think about I suppose I'm thinking about the kind of things that you felt like that have been helpful for you and that you'll also be looking to in terms of the guests on the podcast. I mean, I think for any therapists that are listening, all the things you're saying will be resonating. There might be some other people who are not therapists going, I'm not sure about this whole therapy thing. And like, that's not really a question, Malcolm, but does that resonate?
But actually what comes up for me, John, is what is therapy? And for me, the essence of therapy is love. And so for me, it's a practice of love when I'm running a group or when I'm working with an individual. I'm getting my judging self out of the way. And at Esalen, there are 4 secrets to running a therapy group. One is show up, be present, trust the process, and get out of the way. And I think that's a really neat little package. And that's what I want to do in terms of the podcast, as well as actually to show up and actually draw out, as you're drawing out of me, what's true for other individuals.
Yes.
And I've got some very interesting friends over the years. One from Alternatives, where we put on some of the best speakers in the world around alternative issues, but also the whole therapy world and just the sort of sense of people who are interested in our next stage of evolution, which is what I'm very interested in, is what George Trevelyan. So George Trevelyan was someone we had early on at Alternatives. He was called the grandfather of the New Age. And So George said, he said, there is a new breed coming, Homo noeticus. And I'm very interested in us evolving beyond the lying, cheating, scheming lives that we tend to lead as human beings into a place of that where there's more dignity, where there's more nobility. And the guests that I'll be choosing, that I've chosen some already, but I've been making lists, and it's amazing how many people I've got who are, and who I've spoken to who are interested, are people who've had a major life shift often, but have also found a place inside themselves where I think, to me, the Dalai Lama puts this beautifully, where he says, my religion is kindness. And there's something about how can we evolve into the next step of our humanity, away from war, away from hatred, and towards a place where we are practicing integrity and kindness and compassion.
Yeah. Well, it feels like we're at a real inflection point in human history in terms of what we've got going on in the world. It's what you're describing feels like an emergency, like we need that kind of movement into a different space so that we can live in a world where all of us and all of our families feel safe, feel treated with dignity, and so pleased that you're doing this work, Malcolm, in the various contexts that you are.
Thank you, John. And you've been a great sort of ally in this as well. We've been working together for the last year, and I'm feeling sort of very inspired by our connection and the possibility of actually weaving this work through into your network and all the rest of it. But I remember going back to this sort of like this change in humanity. I remember we had Joanna Macy, who's someone I have a great deal of time for, spoke at Alternatives at St. James's. And she talked about, this is the time of the great turning. There are only two ways we can go from here. One is we are going to evolve and become our next stage of evolution, or two is we're going to disappear from the planet as an experiment that's moved on from, because the Earth will survive, whether or not humanity will survive. We are right in the midst of this right now. And I think we've got to do everything we can to feed that place. And what she said is, I don't know which way it'll go, but we don't really have any wise choice except to feed the part of us that is looking for the next stage of evolution. And I think that's what I'm looking for in myself, is to find, is to practice being a true human, being a human being who is living with as much integrity as possible.
Yeah. And how do you feed that in yourself, Malcolm? Because that can be a real challenge when we're faced with the challenges in our life, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we have to develop support structures for ourselves. One, of course, is meditation. And I do that mostly daily. I fail sometimes, but mostly I do that daily, finding a place of stillness in myself. Two is getting out into nature. And I moved out of London. I moved to Devon when the first lockdown came in 2020. And I often find that if I'm jangled and I go out into nature and walk along by the river or out through the trees, and not everyone has the privilege of having that in their lives right on their doorstep. Again, I feel uplifted. I have very good support structures. I have a regular Monday morning, what we call an inquiry session. So with a friend, and we've been doing this for about 7 or 8 years. And we take 20 minutes each to share what's going on in our lives, and the other then to reflect what they've picked up from what we've been doing. So we take an hour on a Monday morning. I've got a fortnightly triad, 3 of us who gather and again share what's in our lives and look behind the story into what's going on for us. So all the time we're aiming to educate ourselves. There's journaling. There's all sorts of practices that we can take on, and I've written about a lot of these practices in Slay Your Dragons. And there's also the practice of using our relationships to educate us. There's a practice of embracing death. We live in a very death-denying society where actually it is inevitable. I suppose we may develop some chemical means of extending life, but it is inevitable that we are born and we die. And there's something about accepting death. So a friend of mine has become a death doula, and she said, "Oh, when you die," she said, "I'd love to come and be with you when you're dying." And I thought, that's beautiful. Rather than, oh, that's, I don't want to talk about death, but actually I do want to talk. And the Buddhists talk about, about die before death. It's come to terms with that. There's also understanding our suffering, that it is inevitable as human beings that we suffer. And so we have to find ways of managing and developing tools to deal with our suffering. And in my groups, another of the practices is bearing witness. If we really bear witness to each other, then we create an environment in which magic can happen as well.
Yeah. So many different ways, Malcolm. And I guess they're going to get expanded as you talk to guests who are coming on the podcast. The book is a great place for people to also find some of those resources. And I'm thinking about if someone is listening to us who is in the, I guess there must have been some real desperate times for you after your daughter died, some dark times. And if someone is kind of listening to the podcast in that place, they don't have a support system right now, or maybe it's collapsed around them. Sometimes that happens in life. I wonder if you might say something about the things that were helpful to you in those really, really tough times. And
Yeah. I think I want to just go back a step before that.
Okay. Yeah.
And it took me 6 months to grieve. I thought there was something wrong with me. But what had happened for me is that I had, hatred is probably the right word, hated Melissa's mother, who wasn't my ex-wife. Melissa was the result of a brief relationship I had. And I had really disliked her. I'd found her very difficult. She didn't allow me to speak at the funeral. All sorts of things went on. And I found myself full of venom. And then one day, 6 months after Melissa died, we were at a playback theatre celebration of Melissa's life. And I didn't know she was going to be there. And we sort of met and sort of like snarled at each other for a bit. And both our sons came and stood with us. And they held a space where we actually had to speak with our hearts. I don't know where these 20-something-year-old boys found this, but they found something that they held a group for myself and Melissa's mother. And at one stage, I remember sort of like taking her in my arms and sobbing, and everything got released. And I recognized that the hatred had kept me at bay, had kept me away from my grieving process. And after that, the grieving felt like it flowed. And it comes and goes. I can be talking about Melissa very matter of fact, as I'm doing now, but sometimes I'll be talking about her, and even if I'm giving lectures, but I never censor myself. So if I'm talking about her and my tears come, then my tears come. And this came, I just want to fill this bit in, then we'll come back to the original question. This came when Melissa was born. So when Melissa was born, we'd planned this really fantastic home birth with an acupuncturist and a healer and some sound, meditations and all sorts of things. And everything went wrong. And suddenly, after 36 hours, it was an emergency cesarean operation. And I didn't know if Melissa would survive or not. She was in distress in the womb. And she came through and she got delivered and she got put into my arms. And I felt this immense emotion well up in me. And then I looked around and I'm with all these strangers who are nurses and doctors in the room, and I stopped myself. And at that moment, I decided that I would allow emotions to come when they wanted to come. I mean, I'm not going to do this when I'm working with chief executives, usually, although I might if I'm in the right environment. So that there is still a place where I can stop it, but I actually want to let it flow. And when my dad died, I gave the eulogy at his funeral and I cried my way through it. And I remember someone coming up to me after going, that was very different. And I thought, actually, it feels very authentic. I want to learn to grieve. So that was one of the big things that happened for me, is that I got taken into the grieving process in a really big way after Melissa died. And I also recognized who could handle me. I don't mean that I was falling all over the place, but who was able to be with me in those times. And I was in a men's group, and there were two of the men in that group who I didn't feel comfortable with. It wasn't that I needed to talk about Melissa all the time. I needed to be naked. And so when we're naked, we need to be in safe environments. So I learned to find safe environments. And some of the friendships I had were upgraded and some of them were downgraded, not through any sort of particular reasoning, but just I needed to create an environment around me where it was safe to be my grieving, stripped naked, vulnerable self at times, and not to have to play the game of, well, it's been a couple of weeks, so let's move on and let's go out and forget all about this.
Oh, I'm really touched by what you've just described by your sons and that moment when Melissa
amazing. When I think about that, it was amazing.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a beautiful call for all of us who might be next to someone whose distress is showing up in anger, and we like to really hold that space. Can we? Yeah, and to allow ourselves to be emotional. I mean, I think that vulnerability for all humans can be hard, and I think there's a real culture in the West around males and not showing emotion and the stopping, and it's not, as you say, it's not always appropriate, but that when we can, and, yeah, in the moments that we can.
There's something so beautiful about vulnerability. See, there's again one of the other practices I've got is about embracing grief. I remember someone coming to when I was working in a medical practice as a therapist. I remember someone coming to my office, and he spoke about how depressed he was. His wife had just died, and I said to him, "You're not depressed. You're grieving." And it was almost a light had come on him. And as therapists, we can sometimes shine a light that flips things 180 degrees in a moment. And suddenly he was all right with his grief, rather than he'd been trying to suppress it and push it down. We have to learn to grieve. That's the proper response. I remember after the Lockerbie bombing, there was a picture of an 8-year-old boy standing by his parents' grave. And the newspaper said, "What a brave chap, he didn't shed a tear." And I thought, this is such madness that we encourage people to squash their emotions down. We are emotional beings. And I trust, I'm not talking about emotions where we're sort of spilling out all over the place and we're sort of out of control. I'm talking about allowing our emotions to come through us. And there's a study been done at the University of Berkeley in California that says tears carry debris out of the body. We have to relearn how to cry, how to let our tears flow. And I remember doing there was a retreat which was led by Ramdas, who's a great teacher, who I was very fortunate to have become quite friendly with and put on at Alternatives a few times, and did quite a lot of retreats with him. And there was a retreat where there were 40 therapists in the room, and he did a meditation on grief. And half the people in the room were on the floor sobbing, wailing, and I was smugly sitting there thinking, well, I'm in pretty good shape. And he said, and for those of you who are unable to do that, that's your grief. And I recognized then I had very well learned how to block my suffering and to pretend it didn't exist. So coming to terms with our suffering, which is often the result of thwarted desires for things to be other than what they are, coming to terms with my suffering has been a lifelong journey since my early 30s, and I'm now in my approaching mid-70s. But I feel like that's part of the human condition. And rather than, in my younger days, I used to think that the beloved of God wouldn't suffer much, but it's not the truth. And we see some wonderful examples of people managing suffering and almost and becoming awakened through their suffering. Eckhart Tolle was almost suicidal when he woke up, and that's quite rare, that instant moment where it happens. But it was that instant moment was preceded by 10 or 20 or 30 years of great suffering. So I think we have to recognize that it's part of the human condition to suffer. And it's not what happens to us, it's how we manage what happens to us. And that's what I've been trying to do with Melissa. And extraordinarily, as a therapist, people came to me who'd had children who'd taken their own lives. Not because they'd read my book, because it wasn't out at that time when it first happened, but we send out a signal of what we can deal with. And I found that my work had deepened significantly. I was no longer looking at this angle of deep suffering and despair from a philosophical lens. I was looking at it as someone who could share that. Now, I don't. I remember having a conversation with someone I met about The Sopranos, which is the TV series, and she said, "Oh, the therapist in The Sopranos was terrible. She would show her emotions." And I thought, "You're not someone I could be a therapist for, because actually I will show my emotions as a therapist. I won't take over the show, so that I remember running a group once, and my assistant was banging his head on the door and on the floor and sobbing. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is actually allowing our empathy to share suffering. And so the word compassion means with suffering. And I say that in most of my groups. If we can go with each other's suffering, we can allow ourselves to be opened up by it. Yeah.
Thank you, Malcolm. Well, I know we're getting towards the end of our time. I want to squeeze a little bit extra in around. I think as both as therapists, we could easily think about that for lots of other contexts outside of bereavement and having lost someone close to us. But that might not be so obvious to someone that maybe who's thinking, well, I am a CEO, or I do have or maybe a small company to run, or I've got something completely different that I'm struggling with. It's not about death. Like that kind of access to emotions. And could you say a little bit about, because I know you've worked with so many different people in so many different contexts, and yeah.
Well, it's interesting. What I've observed over the years, because I also work in the corporate sector, and I've worked for the European Central Bank and BMW and Cisco Systems and organizations like that. And initially, when I started working with those organizations back 20, 30 years ago, I would wear my disguise. I'd wear my sort of smart jacket and shirt and not stray into the realms of emotion. But latterly, what I've discovered is that actually most people want, not that they have to embrace death at this stage, but most people want to not be in the straitjacket of having to pretend everything's okay. And there isn't a single one of us that gets through this life without great suffering. There is not. That's what I've discovered and learned in myself and also in others. And so if we soften to that rather than harden against it, it starts to become the place where we transform. And that's what I've noticed with the people I'm working with. When it's legitimate for them to honor that place. I remember I was working with one of the defense industry organizations. There was a very sort of like powerful the accounts, the finance person there, and he did some work and suddenly found his tears. Someone who'd been seen as a hard man, very tough, and he found his tears and he was so embarrassed. But then he saw the faces of his colleagues around him who looked at him with compassion and softness for the first time. And he no longer had to carry that hard man act. I'm not saying it changes overnight, it doesn't. But he had experienced the cracking of the facade, of the persona. And that's what we're ultimately looking at, is how to become what we truly are. And Robert Louis Stevenson says, to be who we are and to become what we can become, that is the sole purpose in life.
What a profound statement.
Mm.
Yeah, because we're often looking out into the world where people are other people, and maybe we're doing this ourselves too. We're pretending everything's okay. So we think, well, it's only my life that's falling apart. And that softening that you talk about, like if we could all kind of be welcoming each other's difficulties, suffering.
Yes.
What a difference.
There's a lovely quote I've got in Slay Your Dragons. This is by Michael Mees, the great anthropologist. And he said this: to become equal to the dream sown within us, our heart must break open, and usually must break open more than once. That's why they say that the only heart worth having is a broken heart, for only in breaking can it open fully and reveal what is hidden within. And I feel very blessed in my life that I have gone through a lot of experiences that have ripped me away from my moorings, that have forced me, I would never have chosen it, I don't think we ever choose suffering, although the early Christian martyrs used to do that. They would ask for more suffering from God. But I think that for most of us, we try to avoid suffering. But if we actually turn and face suffering rather than, and soften around it, Stephen Levine has written a lot of books on death and dying and around suffering, so that our first instinct, learned instinct when we encounter suffering, is to harden around it. Whereas the practice that he describes is of softening around it, of allowing it to touch us and break us open.
And I'm imagining those are I'm feeling quite excited about the conversations that you're going to be engaging in. I'm imagining those being conversations about how people have managed to do that in their lives and overcome. Maybe, I mean, we use that word overcome, don't we? But that's not the language that you're using, which,
No,
just catching that.
endorse and embrace. And it's like we never get rid of anything. So overcoming sort of feels like we move past it.
Yes.
But actually it's learning to integrate it into our sense of being. So one of the people I've just been speaking to about doing a podcast with me is a young woman whose mother was murdered. And her journey through the murder of her mother, was murdered by a lover, and her brother was in the house when the mother was murdered, but didn't hear it or see it, and so he didn't get killed as well. So she's been utterly educated by her suffering, and so she's a youngish woman, but she's had to grow up in a big way. This happened probably 10 or more years ago, but and that's become her life now, is of actually helping people deal with their suffering as she deals with her own. I think that's the thing. If we allow ourselves to educate by what we're educated by, that becomes a profound moment.
Yeah. I notice we're just about out of time. Is there any other conversations you might give us a kind of hint at that are
Yes.
coming down the line before we finish? Yeah.
Yes. Another woman who I'll be talking to was a pop star, and sort of living the high life, and developed what was seen as a probably terminal cancer. It didn't end up to be that way, but she had cancer 3 times and was transformed by her cancer. And so she went from being a pop diva to what she calls now a soul healer. And she does beautiful work with sound and music, because they're the things that helped her come through her trials. I've got who else have I got in here? I've got a woman who was a yoga teacher, very beautiful, very able and adept, and was struck down by disease, so that all she could do was lie in bed all day long. And she became an artist, and her art is absolutely exquisite. And she's come through it. It's taken her years and years, but she's now able to come out of her bed, and she's able to come out of herself and recognize that what looked like terrible suffering shifted. I think what I'm recognizing is that this human experience we have, it goes way beyond celebrity, way beyond fame and fortune. We have a shared humanity, and if we can learn to embrace and love our shared humanity and have our hearts touched and use our experiences, rather than to say, that there's some horrible God up there meting out vengeance on us, that actually, and it's easy for me to say that from a position of relative safety. And of course, I look at what's going on in the world around us, and I can't begin to come to terms with that. I'm not so bland as to suggest that, just to embrace the bombs that are dropping on your home or your homeland being destroyed. I'm the jury's still out with that, of how we get through that. But what I am saying is that while we are in this human form with the set of circumstances we've got, it's a great opportunity to actually develop ourselves and become bigger than we've known we are.
That's the challenge that is in front of all of us, and that you're hoping that you will support with the podcast, along with all the other ways that you do the work that you do. And any last comments, Malcolm, as we kind of come to the end before you then move from guest into host, I guess, for the next
You've done a
conversation?
nice job of modeling that for me, John. Thank you very much. I think I'm looking to see education in a very different way in this. I'm looking to see that we get educated. As I often say it in my groups, we're educated by osmosis, by having something happen around us. It triggers something in us that makes a shift. So I actually think that that's what I'm very interested in, is how we educate and support each other towards the next phase of whether we survive or whether we actually become more than we've been. The Hindus call this the Kali Yuga, the dark age that we're in, and there is also the golden age that's part of the cycle, presumably, of birth and death. Who knows all this stuff? But I think that we are moving to the point where it's unacceptable to continue in the ways that we've been, and not only is it unacceptable, we won't survive if we do it. So that's what I want to say. I think that's what inspires me to have these conversations, is to do my very small bit towards uplifting and drawing out the very best that's out there.
Yeah, what a beautiful and important task profoundly important task for the podcast.
There's a lovely phrase, just a quote I'd like to finish on, which is from Mary Oliver, from the poem Wild Geese. And she said, "How will you live this one wild and precious life?" And I think that's beautiful. It's like we've got this one incarnation that we know of. There's John and there's Malcolm here. But we've also, how are we going to make the most of this privilege of being human for a limited period of time before we merge back into the cosmos?
Yeah. Well, there couldn't be something more powerful to conclude on, Malcolm. Thank you for that. And well, it's been a real privilege and honor for me to host you as the first episode of the podcast. I've just, really enjoyed our conversation, feel really deeply impacted by it. I hope others who are listening and who will listen also have the same experience, and really looking forward to the conversations that you will host over the next weeks and months, maybe even years, Malcolm, as it
Yes.
grows. Yeah, thank you.